My name is Dr. Chris Jenkins, and I am the CEO of the Orianne Society and the host of the Snake Talk podcast, the podcast where you learn about nature's most feared, maligned, and persecuted animals. I invite you to listen to this conversation, and maybe you'll find that what you perceive as fear is actually rooted in a deep fascination. Welcome to the Snake Talk podcast. I am sitting here with Andrea Colton, and she is our newest employee at the Orianne Society. And I wanted to do this episode to introduce you all to her and learn more about how she ended up kind of getting to where she is today, and talking about some of the projects that she's working on. We may throw in a little bit of snake info here and there, but Andrea has been working on turtles and is doing a lot of turtle work with Orianne. So this will be a little turtle-focused episode, but she's doing a lot of interesting things. So I think everybody will enjoy it. Welcome to the podcast, Andrea. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Thank you for inviting me on.
Yeah, it's good to have you here. So I'd like to start by having our guests tell us a little bit about how it all began. So how did this interest in reptiles and amphibians, and in your case, turtles, how did this all begin for you? Or is it something that kind of hit you when you were a little kid, something that developed later in life? But what's kind of that origin story of how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, so for me, my interest in herpetology came later in life, not as a kid. For the longest time, ever since I can remember, I knew I wanted to work with animals. I think for the first 14 years of my life, I was sure that I was going to be a zookeeper. Mm-hmm. That's kind of where my love of animals started, was in zoos. I grew up kind of close to the Indianapolis Zoo, and I thought it was the best zoo ever. Every vacation my family and I went on, we had to go whatever zoo was in the town. So that's kind of where I was more interested in exotic animals, and I thought that's where I'd end up. And then it kind of shifted to, maybe being a veterinarian, but I wasn't as interested in domestic animals for a career. I thought maybe a veterinarian for a zoo, but I kind of realized that I wasn't as interested in taking care of animals in captivity. I kind of wanted to get more out with animals in the wild, and I didn't really know how to do that by the time I started college. So I went to Iowa State University and did a kind of broad degree in biology, and used that time and internships and classes to kind of figure out where to go from there.
Okay. So you grew up in Indiana, and vast zoo experience all over the country or world, seeing lots of different zoos. And, and as I'm sure you know now, lots of zoos are actually doing a lot of work on conservation and research and things of that nature, mm-hmm. In the wild. So even as a kid, even though you didn't have that necessarily going out in your backyard and catching turtles, you had that experience as a child where you would go to zoos and see these animals, but you knew that you wanted to work with animals. And so when you went away to Iowa State, you knew right away you wanted to go into biology, or is that something that you figured out later on?
I kind of had to figure it out, because I just didn't really know at the time what career options there were. And I think what really helped me there is I was lucky enough to do an internship in South Africa after my sophomore year at Iowa State. And that was my first time I got to see kind of boots on the ground conservation work. And it was really simple. Most of what we did was we went out and we tracked rhinos and updated the anti-poaching unit with their locations, so they could then go to those locations and patrol and make sure there were no footprints from poachers or anything suspicious looking. And it's like, oh, I guess I had never considered this is something that people do, is that get out there and boots on the ground conservation work. So then I was able to I kind of explored with classes after that, doing management, like wildlife ecology and management, ecological methods, herpetology. I took my first herpetology class, but I still didn't think that I could like make that a career. So mostly I started narrowing in after college when I was able to do a bunch of different fieldwork experiences.
So you went to Africa and were working with rhinos. That's pretty exciting. See any interesting snakes or other reptiles while you're there, or not so much?
No, not really,
Huh.
actually.
And so you said you guys were tracking the rhinos. So I'm assuming using telemetry equipment. Um, and so
Yep.
you're driving around trying to locate them, or you're out on foot, or what does that look like?
Mostly driving around, and that maybe contributed to why we didn't get to see as many herps around. As the interns kind of had to stay in the car a lot of the times, and
Mm-hmm.
the people who worked there were the ones who did. Once we got close enough to the rhinos, they'd go off into the bush and actually get as close to the location as they could.
Gotcha. So would you classify yourself even today as, someone who's like more just kind of generally interested in animals and wildlife, or do you consider yourself like very focused on reptiles or turtles or whatever it might be, or do you kind of think of yourself as more of a generalist?
I consider myself to be more specialist now
Mhm.
that I kind of found my
Yeah,
niche in herpetology.
gotcha. So okay, so you've got your first, sounds like, you get all the zoo experience as a child, and then zoo experience in terms of going to them and seeing them and being inspired by them, and then you go and you're doing a general biology degree. So I'm assuming you're taking all kinds of biochemistry and physics and all these a wide array of classes, but you go away and have this first field experience with mammals, then and then start to kind of focus in with your coursework and experiment a little. And so you're finishing up your undergrad. Well, before we do that, did you have any other kind of, say, formative field experiences during your undergrad, whether that be like another internship or summer job, or independent projects, or anything that kind of got you out into the field experiencing some of these things? Or was it primarily that experience in Africa that drove this?
Yeah, I'd say. Um, so I was in the honors program at Iowa State, and in order to finish with your degree in the honors program, you have to do a project. And that project was actually more focused on plants. I was just looking at kind of how woody encroachment was happening in a prairie, kind of close to the university. Um, but I would say that was more formative for uh, the professor I was working with at the time, Dr. Haldra Rogers, who now works at Virginia Tech. It was more formative because that connection then got me my first job, my first fieldwork job outside of college once I graduated.
Okay. And so you mentioned you took herpetology as one of multiple kind of
Mhm.
classes that was kind of honing you in on working with animals in the wild. And was that, you talked about, and you also talked about finding your niche. So was it that herpetology class that like really was like turned that on inside of like, oh, this is what I want to be doing? Or did that still come later?
It still came later.
Okay. So, okay. So you finish up your undergrad, and
Mhm.
where do you go from there?
I was lucky enough to go to Guam to, again, it was mostly a plant project. I was looking at how rat gut passage affects germination. Um, so I was mostly looking through rat scat that for that job
Hmm.
to plant the seedlings.
Gotcha. And I'm assuming rats are invasive on Guam. They're not. They're exotic. They don't belong there.
Yep, yep, they're invasive. A lot of people, when I tell them that I worked on Guam now, they assume that I worked with brown tree snakes, and I didn't. But I was researching kind of the ecological effects that they had.
Hmm.
Uh, if people don't know, they were introduced to Guam on like a cargo ship from Australia, I think sometime in the 50s, and they quickly expanded and wiped out pretty much every native forest bird on the island. So there's not really birds in the forests to be dispersing fruits anymore, and the forests are no longer healthy as a result of that. So that project was a part of a student's PhD work looking at how invasive pigs and rats might kind of take over as dispersers in that system.
Gotcha. Yeah, so many, as you know, so many of our islands all around the world, just these exotic invasive species just completely destroy the ecosystem. And you've given me a great idea. I don't know why I haven't done this yet, but I certainly need to get somebody on to talk about the tree snakes in Guam. That would be a great episode. And I have some people in mind. So, anyways, but okay, so you're in Guam. Did you see many of the tree snakes while you're there?
Yeah. There were a couple of times I think I found small ones kind of hiding out in leaves during the day. And there were a couple of times we went out to try and find them at night.
Mm-hmm. And what,
Yeah.
give us just like the 30,000 foot level, like what's going on with the brown tree snakes, just for people who don't know about it. Again, I'll do an episode that goes in depth, but like, what's the issue there with the tree snakes? I'm assuming you picked up a lot of information being there. But what is the overall issue with the tree snakes there?
Yeah. So basically the issue is just how easy it is for them to take over that island. They reproduce. The native creatures there don't really have the defenses to combat them, and yeah, they just take over and reduce the biodiversity.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. We're going to have to do an episode on that because it's a great, and there's also threats throughout the Pacific where we're worried about those snakes getting to other islands like Hawaii and places. So there's a lot of info there, but great. So your first job when you finish your undergraduate is on Guam. And how long did you stay in Guam?
9 months.
9 months. And so I'm guessing this is the point of your career where you kind of embarked on the technician job, route. So you're moving from job to job. And so what was the next step in your the technician stage of your career?
So the next step was to kind of diversify my experiences. Up until that point, I had mostly been working on projects that involve, plants. And I knew that I wanted to get more into wildlife. So I was really trying to find jobs that would offer me a wide range of experiences. And I was able to find that at Petrified Forest National Park. So I got to be an intern for that national park out in Arizona. And they did lots of different just kind of monitoring. That's where the herpetology kind of started for me, because we did some herp trapping, just basic monitoring to see what we had throughout the park and where and how many individuals we had. We did some prairie dog work, mostly walking around and mapping burrows to get kind of an idea of how big the colony is and where the burrows are. So we could then come back later and give them little vaccines, because if people don't know, prairie dogs are actually affected by the plague, the fleas that hang out in their burrows. So we were giving them vaccines to hopefully protect them from that, and just some general visual encounter surveys, mostly for birds in the area.
Okay. Right. And so Petrified Forest, where is that in Arizona? Is that up on the Colorado Plateau, like up in that region?
Yeah, it's like
East.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And so talk a little bit more. You talked about, kind of survey and monitoring type work with reptiles and or amphibians. So talk a little bit more about that. What were you guys doing, and what type of animals were you guys seeing?
Yeah, so we were mostly doing drift fences. We had set up drift fences with pitfall buckets and box traps. And we were just doing some basic monitoring to see whatever we could catch. And which ended up mostly being lizards. I think we caught maybe one coach whip the entire time, maybe some toads and spadefoot toads, but most of it was fence lizards and sagebrush lizards.
Okay, and so you're starting to get that herpetology bug. Did you see any snakes while you were there?
Yeah, we also did nightly road surveys. I think about once a week.
Oh, okay.
So it took a while to start seeing things. Once the rains came and stuff was coming out more, they were a lot more interesting than just like a 3-hour drive through the park seeing nothing. But we saw some, occasional rattlesnake, Chihuahua night snake, plenty of spadefoots on the road there as well. Um, some greater shorthorn lizards,
Mm-hmm.
which were always my favorite to see, but we didn't see a ton of them.
Yeah. Okay. So you're in Arizona, and you're up in that northeast, that kind of Colorado Plateau region, and you're getting your first taste of herpetology. So was it um, after that job then that you really started to kind of search out herpetology focused positions? Um,
Yeah,
yeah. And so, how long were you in Arizona?
5 months, I
Five
think.
months.
4, 4 or 5 months.
Gotcha. And then, so then what was the next step?
It was kind of hard after that because I knew, since I was like, oh, it's actually quite interesting and fun working with these herps. They're cool, and I like being able to handle them, and so I really want to explore that more. But I was looking for jobs in October, I believe, so there weren't a ton of herp jobs available for me. So I kind of had to go retail for a little bit, but then spring of the next year, I guess that'd be what, 2019, I got a job with the USGS out the field stations in Dixon, California, but I was working on a San Francisco garter snake project out San Francisco.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we've interviewed, I'm assuming your former supervisor on the podcast here about the garter snakes you're working on. Did you say San Francisco or the Giants or both?
San Francisco.
Okay, yeah, we did a whole episode on San Francisco garter snakes, as you probably know. Um, and another one of my good friends from when I was in grad school is at Dixon, a guy named Pete. He's like a grouse biologist. So, anyways, um, but so you're working on San Francisco garter snakes, which people can go back and listen to that episode. But they're just this very kind of locally endemic group of garter snakes. And so what were you doing with the garter snakes there? Were you working with them in the field? Were you tracking them, marking them? What was kind of the nature of that position?
Yeah, so that was working with them in the field. We had, I think, 4 field sites that we were going to. Again, set up drift fences and box traps and just check them daily and marked them if we found them with the doing a little burn mark on their vents rather than a pit tag. Morphometric data like lengths and weights and everything. And then we were also taking little tail tip samples for genetic analysis. I believe the goal at the time was I was in areas where they knew they were. So I believe their goal at the time was to see if they were genetically diverse enough that they could start maybe taking some out and doing captive breeding and reintroduction.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. So you're still on this technician track, and what's your next step from California? How long were you in California first, for a season or?
Yeah, that one was only, I think, 2.5 months total.
And then where'd you go from California?
California, I went to, again, I was trying to get herpetology related jobs, but I had some bad luck. It was just a bad time that I was searching for jobs because that job ended. And then, I was in San Francisco. So my parents wanted to visit me, wanted to go to Yosemite. So it took some time after that made it. So I was looking for jobs, I think in July, which is not a great time to start any field work. So I ended up on a project back in Iowa for MISM, which is the multiple species and inventorying monitoring program. It's a dual thing with Iowa State and the Iowa DNR. And that's largely focused on just, again, broadly monitoring the stuff that is in the state. So I think they had 5 crews spread out across the whole state. And we just went and sampled different sites, mostly visual encounter surveys, did some small mammal trapping, but just documenting what species we had and which counties we had them in.
So you're kind of doing everything in those surveys. You're looking at birds and mammals and amphibians, reptiles, whatever you might find.
Yep. Looking around, a lot of it was small mammal tracks, small mammal trapping. We even did dragonfly surveys. So I did a lot of
Yeah, that
things.
sounds like a lot of fun. I had a position like that at one point where we were working on like so many different types of wildlife. It was a lot of fun. So, so the audience is probably catching the theme here, and I'm kind of asking you questions in this regard so they pick up on it. But we've talked about it in some previous episodes. But becoming we'll just call it a wildlife biologist, an ecologist, field biologist, in really any field, but in wildlife is very difficult. And there are many people who spend years kind of doing these tech positions, building up experience, so they can get to the point where they can, say go to graduate school or move on to a more permanent position. So I like this. Hopefully people are getting the idea of kind of the dedication it takes, the the openness to move, pick up your life every 6 to 12 months and move to a completely different part of the country or the world, and know you'll be working there for 5 months, and then you're going to have to do that again. So there's to make it in this, it really does take a lot. It takes a lot of dedication. In some situations, a lot of support from, if, a lot of people, in between jobs, they need to go back to their parents for a short time period. And so there's a lot of components to it, but it's a hard field to make it in. And so we're getting closer, though, to that point where you make the jump, but you still have at least one tech position. So where did you go from there? Snakes are one of the most persecuted groups of animals in the world, but we are dedicated to changing that. If you like what we've been discussing here on the Snake Talk podcast, here's an opportunity to turn that inspiration into action. Head over to www.orianne.org and explore how you can support the Orianne Society. Click on Take Action on our menu to make a difference.
I went to the University of Illinois to work for Dr. Michael Dreslick on Massasaugas and Blanding's turtles. But unfortunately, Massasauga field season was going to start March 2020. And there was a little global pandemic that started at the same time. So that field work got canceled and I never really got to work with them. But the university okayed us for the Blanding's work a few months later in May. So I was able to still proceed with that.
Gotcha. And so this is still a tech position though, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yep.
So you're working with Blanding's turtles, and give people like that 30,000 foot level view. What is a Blanding's turtle? Like, what are the general habitats that they live in? And just, what would be the real quick overview of what a Blanding's turtle is?
Yeah, they're like a large aquatic turtle, long-lived. I think they reach about 70. They live often in like prairie marshlands, prairie wetlands, and they're really distinctive with their yellow throats. They've got a very bright yellow throat that is really easy to identify them with, and kind of makes them look like they're smiling at you if you look at them head on.
And what were you guys doing with Blanding's turtles on that project?
Yeah, it was more, monitoring, going out and trapping at a site where we know they are, and taking morphometric measurements, marking any individuals that haven't been marked before. And ultimately, that data was going to go towards putting together a detection model for them.
Mm-hmm. Great. And so you're the other thing people may be picking up on, but as you move around and you're working through, again, trying to get to the point where you go to grad school or you end up, getting a permanent job, you're picking up all these different types of experience. You've done at this point in your career where we're at in this discussion, you've been surveying for birds and mammals and reptiles and amphibians. You've been doing radio telemetry and drift fence surveys and marking animals and measuring all kinds of different animals. So you're picking up all of this real valuable field experience that, again, helps you build your CV and work closer to that, that more permanent stage in your career. So are you now at the point where you're moving to the best tech job you've ever had, or? So
Yes.
that's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah.
So where did you go after that?
So I knew that I wanted to go, uh, you know, Dr. Dresnick had already offered me a master's position towards the end of my time as a technician. And I knew I wanted to stay and do that, but I also knew that, I was really liking the tech work. I always loved getting to move around and see new places in the country and work on different things. So I was like, before I settle down for a master's for 2 to 3 years, I want one last hurrah, one last cool field work job. And that's when I came here and for the Orianne Society as a spotted turtle technician in 2021.
Okay. And so talk a little bit about that. We've been working on spotted turtles for a long time, especially in the Southeast, in the Northeast, but especially in the Southeast. And so talk a little bit about when you were a tech at Orianne, what was it that you were working on?
So I was pretty much exclusively working at one site, Fort Stewart. It's a military base down here. It was part of a larger project across multiple states, mainly South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, to kind of survey in different areas. But I only surveyed on Fort Stewart, and I so unfortunately didn't catch a single turtle my entire time here.
That's funny. Well, I'm sure just being in the Southeast and during turtle trapping season is a very kind of herp active time of the year down here. So, did you have opportunities to see a lot of other interesting reptiles and amphibians?
Yeah, and just being in like the Georgia kind of hard bottom forest wetlands is a very nice and it's peaceful. It's a cool environment to be in. But I, saw lots of alligators, cottonmouths. Had a coach whip launch itself at me at one point. Yeah, so I got to see some cool things, even if it wasn't the spotted turtles.
And so you get this last hurrah, as you called it, kind of field experience, and you come to the Southeast, just incredible diversity. And then when you finished up with us, did you then? Is that when you went back to Illinois, or did you do anything in between?
Nope, I went back to Illinois to start master's work.
Great. Well, talk to us a little bit about that. What was that process like? I guess kind of at the front end, like what was, I know oftentimes the plan doesn't actually turn into the final product, and maybe it did in this case, but like when you're going into the master's work, what was kind of the plan for the focus of your thesis?
Yeah, so towards the end of my time as a technician at the University of Illinois, I got to help out tracking ornate box turtles for another student. And it was one of the funner things that I had done while I was there. It was very frustrating too, because the turtle had a broken transmitter. That's why we were tracking it as frequently as we were. Someone had to go down every day to track it, make sure we didn't lose it. And it had wandered kind of far. So I spent like an hour walking around trying to pick up a signal. And then once I got down to the area it was in, I still spent like 15 minutes trying to search for it. And then eventually looked over and saw it. And it's just like such a satisfying feeling of finally locating that turtle after all that work. And it was just super fun. So that's what I was able to come back and do my master's on, was ornate box turtles. And I focused on their physiology and thermal ecology to kind of look at the energetics of the turtles at our sites in Illinois. And yeah, it took a while to kind of narrow in on a project because there were so many things that I could do and like tracking them really frequently to try and make determinations about the habitat that they're in. But, I couldn't do that. So yeah, I eventually settled on determining resting metabolic rates so we could make baseline estimates for energy expenditures. And then also looking at how they are thermoregulating throughout the year to kind of make observations about those patterns.
So First, what is a lot of people are probably familiar with box turtles, right? There's a huge proportion of people in the United States that overlap with them, and they often could be one of the turtles that's seen regularly crossing roads or even in the woods. But what makes an ornate box turtle different than the box turtle that most people are seeing?
So most people are probably seeing the more common is an eastern box turtle, which is more of a, you're going to find those more in like a forest system, but eastern box turtles are a prairie species. So they're in that kind of tall grass or sand prairies,
Ornate
the
box
remnants of
turtles
it.
are a prairie species. Yep. Okay.
Yes.
You said eastern. I just didn't want to confuse folks. So
Oh, sorry.
no, no.
No.
Um, and so that's the primary box turtle that you'd find throughout the basically much of the Midwest and these prairie ecosystems.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to talk a little bit about the thesis and the focus there, but I did my PhD in a lab with a environmental physiologist and one of the pioneers in thermal ecology and all of that, and it. I've always said that it's so critically important for people to understand reptiles, but unfortunately, I think a lot of people in our field don't take whatever you want to call it. I'll say environmental physiology, but there's different titles for it. But it's just so critical especially for terrestrial reptiles, but really all reptiles and amphibians, any ectothermic animals.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it controls so much of their lives. So I think it's great that you focused on that, and I do think that anybody getting into herpetology at a minimum should take a course that explores some of these concepts, energetics and thermal ecology and so on. So, um, did you uh, did you have an interest in that, or were you kind of led there by Mike, or what was how did you get to that point? Because again, a lot of people, while they should be, are not focused or don't even have a great base understanding of it.
Yeah, and I think I was led there initially by Mike. I know he had been really interested in doing something with respirometry. So he definitely kind of put the seed in there. But once I started looking into it more, I started realizing exactly what you just said. Like energetics is so important when it comes to the health of the individual, but also the health of the population. Um, because when you think about like a box turtle, if the environment is too hot for them, if it's inhospitable, if they don't have places that they can go to get away from that, maybe they're forced underground. And if they're underground, they're not on the surface foraging and eating and gaining that energy to be able to grow. And maybe it takes them a while to reach maturity. And now that affects, recruitment because you don't have as many turtles reproducing. And it has cascading effects for the whole population. So I think, yeah, once I started looking into it more and learning more about that just made me very like, yeah, this is research that I'm interested in. I'm glad I'm doing
Yeah.
it.
And I should say, obviously, this topic of environmental physiology is critical for all, and energetics and so on is critical for all animals. But mammals, as an
Mm-hmm.
example, we've learned as endotherms, or the fact that we produce much of our, energy internally. I mean, we don't, we ingest food and we, let's just say maintain a constant body temperature versus reptiles that, their body temperature is controlled by the environment. We've decoupled ourselves from kind of the physical environment in many ways. And so, but reptiles haven't done that. And so it's really affects
Mm-hmm.
so much of what they do. But anyway, I'll get off of that soapbox. And um, so let's talk about your box turtles a little bit more. So, um, what was kind of like the central idea or kind of hypothesis questions you were looking at answering, with these energetics studies in ornate box turtles?
So kind of where we wanted to go with it was maybe figuring out what their patterns were throughout the active season, so you could uh, do some sort of summer habitat work, maybe like a summer prescribed burn, or if you needed to mow in an area, like kind of um, determining their regulatory patterns and when they might be more likely to be in shaded areas or underground, so you could do that work without harming them. Um, and then also kind of tying in the respirometry with it, you know.
So explain that. What is that?
Yeah. So I determined their resting metabolic rate. That's essentially like the energy it takes for them to survive, just exist, sitting on the landscape. How much energy it costs to be a turtle. So I brought them in, determined those rates at different temperatures. All those turtles that were brought in also had data loggers on their shells. So when they went back out onto the landscape, I knew what temperatures they were reaching throughout the season, and I could apply those resting metabolic rates to those temperatures to kind of get an idea of baseline energy, like how much it costs to be a turtle. So then that kind of like provides a starting point for, you know, adding on some of those other processes. How much more energy is it going to cost them, or how much more energy is it going to cost them if their landscape heats up significantly and they can't maintain some of those cooler temperatures? They're forced to maintain a higher temperature that causes them to use more energy just to exist.
Gotcha. So you're so again, mammals have kind of decoupled themselves from temperature to a large degree. But with these turtles, you're taking them and you're putting them in this like across, looking at how much energy they use or their metabolic rate across a wide range of temperatures. And then you put these animals out into the wild, and you see the situations that they physically use in the environment, and you're able to understand, what their metabolic rates are, how much energy they're using if they're sitting in the shade of a large tree versus broken shade of some prairie grass versus sitting out in the open sun, and then there's it sounds like there's an applied angle to the research too, meaning I don't know what the activity might be, putting in a parking lot or doing prescribed fire, for example, and what that does to the environment, and looking at how either different impacts or management strategies on the landscape impact kind of the potential metabolic rates of the turtles. Is that a good summary?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what did you end up finding?
So I found what I definitely should have found, which is that temperature and weight affect metabolic rates. So the bigger the turtle, the higher the metabolic rate, the higher the temperature, the higher the metabolic rate. I also, for my research, found a difference between site, where turtles at one site had significantly higher metabolic rates than another site, but
at the same temperatures. So if you had them in a lab and they were both at whatever, pick your favorite temperature, one population had higher metabolic rates. That's interesting.
Yeah, but I do think that is more product of the size, because the turtles at the site with higher metabolic rates are on average larger than the ones
okay.
with the lower metabolic rates. So I think that might just be how the model's shaped up. But and then when it comes to the thermoregulatory behaviors, I actually found that they largely conform to their environment. So in order to determine that, I had, again, those temperature loggers on the real turtles, and then created 6 models to go to each of the sites that turtle shaped and painted to look like a turtle. Put data loggers on those as well, and put them in different microhabitats to compare what the turtles were reaching and what the models were reaching. Because if on average the turtles had like a much lower temperature than the models, that would indicate that they're seeking out cooler conditions, and vice versa. For if they're hotter than the models, they're seeking out warmer conditions. But I found that they mostly just kind of conform to the temperature that's around them. So that could be an advantage if they don't need to be at a specific temperature, if they can exist at a range of temperatures. That generally it's better for animals if they can tolerate a lot of different conditions rather than one specific one.
Okay. So describe, I mean, I know what you're talking about, but for the audience, you said these models, and
Yes.
you talked about something shaped and colored like a turtle, but what is that? Like what are you physically making this thing out of? And
It's resin plastic. So they're these kind of like little oval resin plastic black models that we painted yellow stripes on to kind of mimic the aerial patterns of an ornate box turtle.
gotcha. And then you somehow have something that's like recording temperature inside of that, and you're putting that into different environments, maybe some out in the open sun and some in the shade and some in a hole, whatever it might be, and looking at
Yep.
temperatures. Huh. And how are you measuring the temperature of the turtles?
Like the data loggers that I use.
Yeah. How are you so you put a turtle out in the wild. I guess it could be in captivity as well, but more so like once you put these turtles back into the wild, how are you measuring the turtle's body temperature? The actual turtles, not the model. Whether you're passionate about preserving biodiversity, ensuring the survival of threatened species, or simply want to contribute to a healthier planet, there's a role for you. Your support isn't just a contribution, it's an investment in a future where our ecosystems thrive. Go to www.orianne.org to donate or become a member today.
I had eye buttons, or what they're called. They're these tiny little like nickel-sized data recording devices, and they can record temperature down to like a 0.5 degrees Celsius accuracy. So I took epoxy, put it on the shell, stuck the eye button to it. So that's how I was able to get their temperatures.
Okay. And so you mentioned that the turtles are just kind of conforming to they're not like, if it's really hot, their body temperature is going to be relatively high. They're not really like seeking out the coolest temperatures in that environment, or vice versa. So how do they, I mean, obviously it can get pretty hot in those prairie states. Like they must be avoiding these extreme high temperatures. I mean, did you see any interesting behaviors in the turtles in terms of, say, avoiding extreme cold or warm temperatures?
Yeah, there's so most of the sites are pretty overgrown with just tall grass and shrubs and things that makes it kind of hard to see them. But one site is very open. There's not a ton of vegetation. It's very sandy. It's very easy to find them. And on a really hot day, I could guarantee that there would be a turtle sitting underneath every like tree that was out there. There weren't a ton of trees out there, just like, kind of small trees, and there would go up to them. There would always be a turtle sitting under one.
Gotcha. Okay. Interesting. And so, so you're still writing your thesis, correct? You finished the field work. Sounds like you've probably finished a lot of the data analysis, but you're finishing that up. So what was kind of the next step? You couldn't stay away. Had to come back to Orianne Society. Is that right?
Yep. That's what happened.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about. I mean, I was involved in that process a little bit, but like, how did that happen? And the point I'm trying to get at here, and I did this with both of my graduate degrees, is starting the next thing before you're done with the last. And but how did that happen? That you ended up getting a more permanent position with the Orianne Society before finishing your thesis? How did that all come together?
I had seen a job posting for it in January, I think, when it originally came out, and I reached out to Houston because I was interested, but it just seemed like the timing wasn't really going to work at the time because they needed someone to start, or you needed someone to start pretty right away, and I wasn't quite at a point where I probably could have done both at the same time, because I don't believe I had any of the analysis really done, or definitely not finalized at the time. But then the stars aligned and the job start date kind of got extended, and I got to a point where I was like, I can do this at the same time, and it's a job working with turtles. What could be better than that?
Mhm.
So I decided to take both on at the same time.
That's great. So you now have moved from the Midwest and you're living down here in the Southeast. And what is it that you do for the Orianne Society? Describe your new position here.
Yeah, so the title is Associate Conservation Scientist, and I'm mostly in charge of two turtle related projects for the next few years, working with spotted turtles and with eastern box turtles. So, our spotted turtle research, as my time in 2021 as a technician taught me, it's really difficult to catch spotted turtles in the Southeast. They're very good at evading capture. So, we don't actually have, we have an idea of where their range is. But there's plenty of places in the Southeast, in South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida specifically, where we just don't really have data uh, in those areas. So we're kind of looking at identifying or focusing on those data gaps, trying to find new sites, and we'll be trapping there to try and find some new spotted turtle populations across those three states.
And so that's um, part of the project. And it's worth mentioning that this is, there's kind of a range wide effort to gather information on spotted turtles. And this is part of it. And I would argue that probably
Mm-hmm.
the place that we you know the least about spotted turtles is in the Southeast. There's been quite a bit of
Mm-hmm.
work in the North done on spotted turtles. Um, so you're really doing a lot of kind of broad scale surveys. And as you mentioned, it can be hard to find spotted turtles and to survey for them. And in many years, it's actually a pretty short window where you can really effectively, survey for these turtles. So how are you going to manage to survey such a broad area, across these three states with such a small window?
We're definitely going to be hiring on some technicians to help us.
Well, yeah, there you go. So we're going to be hiring a good number of people. So anybody listening who wants to take on the technician journey that Andrea's been through over the years, these will be positions that they're coming out for multiple years. So um, there's that. So you're doing the broad scale surveys. Are you involved? So we have the two long term sites in Georgia where we've been monitoring turtle populations for a long time. Um, and I
Mm-hmm.
know that we also have the goal of establishing some additional long-term sites, either in Georgia, but more so in South Carolina and Florida. Talk about that part of the project a little bit, kind of the long-term monitoring component.
Yeah, so I think there's only one long-term monitoring site in both Florida and South Carolina. So that's kind of what this project will allow us to do too, is address some of those data gaps and get a better idea of the range, but also hopefully find some sites that have a stable enough population that you could turn them into a long-term monitoring site. And we do have radio transmitters that I'm hoping if we go out, kind of do this broad effort, hit a bunch of sites, spread out your effort. Hopefully, you can get one turtle, put a transmitter on it, and that turtle will lead you to the other turtles, at least kind of where they mostly congregate. And hopefully, we will be able to find some long term monitoring sites as a result of that.
Okay. Great. And what you mentioned? The other project that you were really focused on was getting back to your box turtles, but this time eastern box turtles. So what are you focused on there?
Yeah, so that's a kind of quick project down in South Central Georgia. We'll be going to a site and looking for box turtles and putting transmitters on them. And we've also got these GPS loggers that we can stick on them as well. So someone doesn't have to go out every single day and try to get a location for them. We'll only have to go out once a month and make sure they're still around. We haven't lost them, or, batteries aren't dying on anything to be replaced. And that'll hopefully give us some really good, uh, lots of good data about where they are throughout their time, throughout their active season. So we can then kind of make determinations about the habitat that they're in most often, and what time of year they're in that habitat, and get an idea of home range size as well.
I'm assuming box turtles, whether they're ornate or eastern, have relatively small home range sizes compared to a lot of turtle species. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, that's what I've seen with ours in Illinois.
Yeah.
Although there's some of them, for the most part, they're small. There's always the ones that go way off into private property that I don't see for the rest of the year.
Yeah. So describe these GPS transmitters a little bit, so the audience can get kind of an idea of how those work.
Yeah, they're just these little rectangular. They're very small. They're, again, about the size of a quarter, with a little antenna on it, and you just, again, epoxy on the shell, put the logger onto the epoxy so it's there, and it can pick up on multiple different satellites. Just preliminarily looking at the data, it seems like it takes about maybe 5-6 satellites, GPS locations from 5-6 satellites, and then kind of averages it into one location to get you an idea of where that turtle was.
Yeah, that's great. And then, like I said, then we don't need to have somebody in the field every day or every few days or whatever it might be tracking down this animal. The satellites are doing it for us. So excellent. Well, what I know you're fairly new in this position, and it might be strange talking to me as the CEO in this question I'm about to ask, but just ignore all that. And like what, so thinking about the future and what you, might do in this position at Orianne. I mean, there's certain things that you're interested in, that you would like to be working on into the future, and ideas that you have, kind of just getting at that future component within the Orianne Society. What are kind of your interests and thoughts there?
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes Orianne so great is the heavy emphasis on applied research, coming up with projects and answering questions that you can then take and directly help manage for some of these species. So I'd love to keep doing that. I also am interested in doing projects that kind of focus on some of the more common species, because that's not something that, it seems like a lot of times people like to go for the species that are already in trouble, and you're kind of trying to figure out how to get them back up and running. But I think there's value in, some of those long-term monitoring projects, or doing things like what we're doing with the eastern box turtles, because that's a fairly common species, gaining the knowledge now, and hopefully being able to implement some of the management decisions as a result of that knowledge before they get to the point of really needing some heavy intervention.
Okay, great. Well, I like to have all of my guests imagine that maybe they're out in the field and just finished a hard day of trapping turtles, and you're sitting around a campfire, and I turn to you and ask you to tell me your best snake story. What would you tell me?
I think so. I would say my best snake story actually happened this past spring with your indigo technician, Peyton. I was able to go out with her for a day, and on our indigo surveys that we were on, we we're walking down this road and kind of looked over to this tree, and it looked like there was some small burnt logs underneath it. And oh, wait a minute, those are two indigos. So we like dart to either side of the tree, and we're trying to figure out how to best attack them. But the problem is, I think we both thought there was only one indigo at the time. And like I had seen one and she had seen the other, and we were just confusion. She was able to grab one, the other one went into a hole. So we went back to the truck and processed the one, and then on our way back, the one that had gone into the hole was out. So we were able to grab that one too. But so it was just cool to see, indigo snakes are a great snake, and it was cool to see what was probably a mating pair, because one was female and one was male. But I also think that it's just like that's what it's like in herpetology. That's what it's like being with herpetologists, is just leaping on snakes and those moments of like hectic where you see something cool and you just have to grab it. I think that really shows how fun it can be.
That's great. So were those your first indigo snakes in the wild, or had you seen them before that?
Nope. I had helped Ben with some surveys my first time around. So I had seen them before, but that was just a particularly fun diving on snakes moment.
Gotcha. Yeah, indigo snakes are pretty amazing. Seeing one in the wild is quite an event. So great. Well, thank you for sharing that. Welcome to the staff here at Orianne. I'm glad to have you and excited for what the future holds and things we can learn about spotted turtles, box turtles, and beyond. So, thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Great. And I just wanted to thank the audience and tell everybody to remember, snakes are animals too, and it's a privilege to see one in the wild.